So the threat bucket is how stressors accumulate in our lives. So shout out to Missy Bunch, my fantastic mentor, for this concept. Every stressor counts. So whether it's in the past, whether you've healed from it or you've been to therapy for it, it is still a stressor that happened to you in your life. Your body and brain had to respond with stressful processes. So little stressors count: an argument, an injury, too much caffeine, poor sleep, dehydration, emotions. Relationships, I think, is an interesting one because we often think about, relationships that didn't have closure, or maybe relationships that are always rocky every time you see somebody. Those things will rise the water in your threat bucket. So an overflowing bucket, we always hear these stories of people who say, "Oh, I bent over, picked up a napkin and threw out my back," or suddenly my injury from high school like flared up again. This is because your threat bucket was literally was about to overflow, and that bending over was just the drop that had it spill over. So, how to drain your bucket? We improve communication through your cranial nerves, which the vagus nerve is a cranial nerve. So your brain perceives less threat, therefore it has more safety. This is what I help you with in my sessions. And again, we'll talk about that more. One thing I wanted to highlight was, for me, just merging these two rehab worlds was so interesting. So many of my patients diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, fibromyalgia, multiple sclerosis, those patients had experienced a traumatic event that preceded their diagnosis, right? So their threat bucket was full, and suddenly they have this diagnosis. Being a caregiver, I don't think caregivers get enough credit for how stressful that is. So, being a caregiver, a lot of those patients that were caregivers to a loved one ended up being my patients with a stroke or some type of medical diagnoses following caregiving for their loved one because of how stressful it was. It is also common that old injuries suddenly started hurting again. So I would always tell people, I didn't know what the threat bucket was at the time, but I always told my patients that, right, like if you just had a stroke, injury from when you were 7 is suddenly hurting again. Well, the brain has to prioritize, right? It's like the stroke is more recent, it's more intense, so it's got to heal that more and control that. But that just shows you how much our body was doing in the background to keep that old injury at bay, and how their prognosis and rehab really mattered depending on their support system and their attitude. Those are huge. Okay. So with releaseology, I work on releasing your body's own healing potential. So I address how your brain and body programmed your brain and body to react and train it how to do it a different way this time. So the path to healing, you cannot force calm. So even if enough threats aren't removed from your threat bucket and the body doesn't feel safe, healing will not happen. How I can help, again, by activating these specific cranial nerves, we decrease threat signals that your brain receives, which allows stored tension, emotion, and trauma to release naturally. At Releaseology, I am helping people heal from disorders and diagnoses I was taught not possible.